A years-long journey to save his failing heart. On today's All Things Heart, how Brian Pitts went from patient to survivor and now thriver on an incredible mission.
From the University of Kansas Health System.
I am amazed. The team here is great.
I came on a Tuesday, and then by Saturday I had a heart in me.
I have never seen a group of people work together so good as this team of heart specialists. I mean, it's just unreal.
Stand by to set up show.
And the Dolph C. Simons Jr. Family Broadcast Studio.
Roll it.
Always makes you feel like you're the most important patient on the planet.
I felt heard, and that was really big.
This is All Things Heart.
Good morning, I'm Alexis Del Cid. Welcome back to All Things Heart. Right now, there are around 3,500 people in the U.S. waiting for a new heart. That's according to the Department of Health and Human Services. At one point, Brian Pitts was one of those people waiting. And now, having just celebrated a milestone with his new heart, he's made it his life's work to encourage organ donations.
All eyes are supposed to be on the bride during a wedding, but the attention quickly turned to one guest, Brian Pitts, when he suffered a heart attack. Lucky for him, the bride happened to be a registered nurse who performed CPR until paramedics arrived.
And I woke up the next day not knowing anything that had happened. And they said, you've got hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It was something I was born with. It's a congenital defect.
That was 2007. Doctors implanted a pacemaker defibrillator. And for years, he met with his University of Kansas Health System cardiologist, Dr. Lauren Berenbaum. 4 years later, Brian's life would be saved a second time when that defibrillator worked exactly as it was supposed to work.
And got kind of woozy, dizzy, leaned on the counter, and boom, the thing shocked me, and it doesn't feel good. I'll tell you that. It is literally shocking from the inside out.
10 years later, in 2021, it happened again.
I got down to my knees in the living room and I shouted for my wife, and sure enough, the thing hit me.
But after this event, doctors gave him another jolt with the news that Brian was in heart failure. He needed a transplant.
Started to do more testing and really looking at what's going on with the heart, and indeed, he confirmed that I'm in heart failure from hypertrophy, and I need a heart. Hearing that was pretty shocking.
Then Brian got COVID.
And I am horribly sick. My heart's doing weird things.
He recovered and made it onto the transplant list.
I was listed for 63 days until I received my new heart. I woke up pretty quickly after surgery. I think I was awake about 5 hours after surgery.
His gratitude now powers him on a new mission.
I think everybody in America should be a registered organ donor. It's that important.
So important, he's even put donate life messages on his Jeep.
And now I drive around town as the donate life guy.
Brian also mentors fellow patients who are preparing for heart transplants. He also serves as a volunteer ambassador for the Midwest Transplant Network.
Having been through it and having to come to terms with it, I think I'm able to more easily console these people for what's going on in their life.
A patient, a survivor, and now an advocate.
Wow, we are so pleased to have Brian joining us here in the studio today. So great to have you here. And he is flanked by his cardiologist, Dr. Lauren Berenbaum. And on his other side, we're joined by the cardiac surgeon who did his heart transplant, Dr. Matt Danter. Thank you for making time to be here. Brian, first of all, I want to go back to the beginning of your story. The bride did CPR on you?
She did. She was a registered nurse, and she had a job at a nursing home. And thankfully, this wasn't during the ceremony. We were after the wedding at the reception, but I collapsed on the floor. I was in fibrillation.
Oh my gosh. And how well did you know, just to get this out of the way, how well did you know her? Were you an ancillary guest? Or?
She was a niece to my wife at the time. And funny enough, the ambulance driver was a cousin. And so when they got the call, they came real fast thinking maybe grandpa had gone down. And they got to me in about 4 minutes.
Well, that's just another example of why it's so important to know CPR. You could save someone's life at your own wedding. Brian, you recently celebrated 2 years with your new heart.
Sure
right?
did. Yep.
Have you had any complications within the last 2 years? How are you feeling?
The first year I had a couple of bouts of rejection. Showed up as R2 rejection. One time they admitted me and did an infusion, sent me home in a couple days, and everything was fine. The next time, they just upped my medications, and everything kind of checked out normal again. And that's kind of normal through the process for several of us, that they're leveling your medications out and kind of find where you need to be.
Right.
Just recently, I was diagnosed with cardioallograft vasculopathy, which is a unique form of coronary artery disease to transplant patients. So it's a thickening of the coronary artery, and it's thought, I guess, to be an immune system response that's inflammatory.
So Dr. Danner, does that mean his body doesn't like the new heart and what does that mean?
No, I mean, it's likely an immune-mediated inflammation that affects coronary arteries, and it's kind of thing, if everybody had their allograft long enough, then they would sort of develop it. But so we try and mitigate it just like any other coronary risk factors, and there are times when people need to have, based largely on symptoms or angiography, they have to have an intervention done. But you've been all right with so far?
Yeah. Changed my meds up and work on cholesterol meds and stuff like that, and they should be able to halt it and maybe even do some reversal.
You were waiting for 63 days for your heart, and is that a normal time to wait, or is that short, long?
That's a complicated question to answer, because it depends a lot on your blood group, your size, your gender, sort of how long you've been listed, all these kind of things. 63 days for what status? I can't even remember what status you were.
I began at status 4.
Yeah, so at a status 4, that's a very short period of time to wait, to be honest. Probably was upgraded, right?
I went to a 2.
Went to a 2.
So I think we wrote an exception to get to status 2, and then that's where it went pretty quickly. So I imagine you're probably a month or so as a 4, and then after you go to it depends on what status you're listed at. So as a status 2, he'd probably wait on average 7 to 14 days, something like
Okay,
that.
so the lower the number of the status, the worse you are?
Right.
The more urgent it is?
The more urgent your status is based on your clinical need, yeah.
So Brian, those 63 days while you're waiting, what did that feel like to you, and how did you function?
Boy, it's just hearing the initial news from this guy that, hey, you need a heart transplant, was devastating. I mean, that's, in my opinion, the mother of all surgeries. He might say different. So, I mean, it really was go home and prepare. Emotionally rocked. My wife is now kind of hysterical. My children are terribly worried. And I'm thinking about end-of-life things that I never thought I'd have to think about at this age. 60-odd days at 4, when they said, you'll probably wait 7 months to a year, it went blisteringly fast. And all of a sudden, I'm having some tachycardic events, and they say, that's it, we're going to admit you. And 3 days later, get my gift. It was a whirlwind. I couldn't process all of it even. It happened so fast.
Dr. Berenbaum, Brian talks about how it rocked his world when you gave him the news. How on earth do you deliver that news?
Carefully.
Yeah. Were you prepared? Are you always prepared for emotions, the emotions that come with that? Are you trained in that, or is that just you learn on the job?
Well, I actually started doing transplant cardiology 40 years ago, although I got out of that field and haven't been directly involved, but that certainly gave me a few years of experience.
Sure.
In
more than a few.
Delivering that kind of news to people, but there isn't any way to say it, but you
can't beat around the bush with something like that, right? Brian, you have so much to live for. You've shared some really nice pictures with us, and I would love to share them with the audience of what life looks like for you now. Tell us what you're up to.
Oh, there's my carrot harvest. So we run kind of a small scale farm. You might say a hobby farm. We've got chickens, and we've got ducks and geese, and there's my Great Pyrenees. I've got 2 of them that patrol the property. We're on 7¼ acres out in Baldwin City.
Who's that?
And that's my daughter Olivia. She's tested with the gene for hypertrophy. All 3 of my children have, my biological children. This man next to me insisted that we get these children tested for the gene, and he made that happen for us.
Thank God. And it was not easy, even though Brian has it and all 3 of his kids tested positive. Dr. Berenbaum, being able to get him tested wasn't a slam dunk, was it?
That's something that's evolved over time. I started seeing Brian in 2016.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm getting at is you had to fight with the insurance companies.
In
to get them to cover
2016, it was more of a battle with insurance companies than it is today.
Right.
But yeah, insurance companies don't like to do anything that they can that's new.
I mean, our doctors are becoming, and you are now the front lines fighting the battle so that you can actually treat your patients and get them the care and have it covered.
Unfortunately.
It's remarkable. I want to talk about what Brian was diagnosed with. He was diagnosed with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. What is that?
So hypertrophic means the heart muscle is thicker than normal. And cardiomyopathy, cardio is heart, myo is muscle, and path is abnormal or sick. So it's a sick heart muscle that is too thick. And you might think that's a good thing. I mean, if you think about somebody who's a weightlifter and they've got, big, strong muscles, you go, wow, that guy's, really in great shape. But your heart does a particular kind of work. It works 24/7. It's more like the work that a swimmer does. And a swimmer's body and a weightlifter's body look very different, even though you look at them and they're both obviously fit and muscular.
That's a great comparison.
And so thick hearts have problems, or can have problems.
What would, Brian, you had this your whole life, but you didn't know until everything started to go south. What kinds of symptoms can people watching look out for to know if they have this hypertrophic cardiomyopathy?
So sometimes, unfortunately, the initial presenting symptom is a cardiac arrest.
Oh, geez.
And if that happens, then you're lucky to be successfully resuscitated. You happen to be in the right place.
So your first symptom was at the wedding?
Right place, right time.
Oh my gosh.
I think about 90% of people that experience their first as a cardiac arrest die. So I'm that 10% that made it.
And it was CPR. Can't stress this enough. It was CPR that saved Brian. We have some echocardiogram clips of Brian. Doctor, what are we seeing here?
I'm going to hope that that's a normal heart.
Okay. So that looks normal, and then what's that?
And that's another view of a normal heart.
Beautiful. So that's...
And the what's centered on the screen there is the left ventricle, the main pumping chamber of the heart.
Okay.
Now this is Brian's heart, and you see in the middle there that great big thick structure. Well, on the normal heart, it was about 1/3 that thickness. Now we're back to normal.
Oh, you can completely see the difference when you show a thick
that
heart.
wall is really thick. And now this one's normal again.
So to the untrained eye, it looks gray and black, but when you describe it now, I can see exactly what you're talking about. How often does this disease end up requiring a heart transplant?
We have a center of excellence here in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with 700 plus patients. And we send 1 or 2 per year for a heart transplant, typically. There may be a year with none, but it's usually 1 or 2.
When it comes to actually getting that heart, Dr. Danter, can you talk about the journey to actually get the heart, where it came from, or how you find out about we've got a heart for Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember off the top of my head where it came from, but it's usually a process. We get a call that has a suitable organ, potentially, and we review all the images and the information from the donor, and it's already been matched, to his blood type and these kind of things. And then, I kind of tell people that if, you have to be patient, because I could tell you when the heart transplant's going to go, and the only thing you could be certain of is that's not when the heart transplant will be going. So the reality is that it's kind of a lot of moving parts and a lot of sort of timing that occurs. then planning that goes into it. And we have a dedicated team of coordinators, and we liaise with MTN and TCOA, which are organ procurement organizations that help coordinate that whole effort. But as you can imagine, it's very rarely is it just an isolated organ. So we'll start the process on a Monday, and we may not do the transplant until Wednesday or something like that, right? But the procedure itself, for someone who hasn't had surgery before, is relatively straightforward in terms of the timing of things. But there's often delays as you're proceeding. You know, the liver team might want to do a biopsy, or the lung team doesn't like the gases, so now they'll decline them and they try and reallocate them. So there's a lot of starts and stops. And so for families, I tell you, they just have to be patient, and we have a great team of liaisons too. They go out and say, you know, we're delayed because the donor site needs to do a liver biopsy or something like that.
So how long do you have from the point in which the donor passes? How long do you have to get that heart into Brian? Is there a maximum time before it's not good anymore?
Not really. So our goal is to try and have an ischemic time of less than 4 hours. But we have multiple new technologies. We have you know, a balance between how sick the patient is versus how far we're willing to travel. We have new devices and new sort of modes of organ procurement that we're exploring. And I'm Canadian, so we used to have, you know, Canada's a much geographically bigger country with the population spread way out, so we would have flights of 3.5, 4 hours in and of themselves. So you get kind of comfortable with broadening the ischemic time that you can tolerate. But typically, our goal is to get it with the heart out of the body for no less than, you know, for less than 4 hours. I mean.
Okay. And then, what are the key things that you're looking for to make sure the heart's a good match?
Well, basically size, blood group, and function. So, in absence of sort of things that would preclude us from using it, like. There's a whole, I mean, the list is as long as your arm of the relative.
But it has to match. Like, has
it
to
has
be
to match. Yeah, it has to match in terms of AVO compatibility. It has to match in terms of size, and it has to be of good function, with no significant lesions or disease in it.
Sure.
And then, you know, basically, those are the critical elements of it, to be honest.
In 2018, there was a change in transplant allocation, heart transplant allocation. What was the change?
Well, the change was done to prioritize people who are sicker. And what happened essentially is we used to have a system where you were status 1, 2, and 3. And there was 2A and 2B, and you were status 2A, which is relatively high on the list based on whether or not you had mechanical circulatory support or LVAD in place. The status 1 people were relatively the same, and it's very sick people on mechanical circulatory support or very high status. Now we have a system of 7 categories that I think were done with the best of intentions, but initially the results were not great for the changes in the allocation system. So we used to take very stable people who were well supported on durable LVADs and take them for an operation where they're not decompensated. And now what we do is we have a number of far sicker people that are going for organ transplantation, people on support, people in hospital for months, and these kind of things that are sicker because, you know, like Brian was saying, he's listed as status 4. He could wait. If you're a blood group O on an LVAD listed at status 4 and nothing changes, you're very stable, you're out of the hospital, you're doing fine. You're going to wait a year or 2 for an organ if you're lucky, and that's if you're not, you know, 6'4" and 200 pounds. So it's very, very challenging now, and you know there is a very strict, as there should be, framework for how we allocate, you know, and assign status, but it did sort of dramatically change the that's a whole discussion about why that happened as well, but it did sort of change our approach to almost overnight about what you do. So you saw people, programs had, you know, relatively balanced durable MCS platforms that they use for people.
What's MCS? Like
mechanical circulatory support, LVADs, and these kind of things. And then overnight you went from everyone's using acute MCS to get them to transplant. So VAD numbers have gone down dramatically over the country as a result of this. Also, the acuity of the people going for transplant has gone up dramatically, and as a consequence, the early studies, three of the first 5 studies about what happened in terms of outcomes after the allocation change showed that it was detrimental.
Oh, so this was not a good change, but you...
Not in my opinion.
No. Well, I would trust the doctor.
Nobody listens to me anyway.
We do. We listen to you. 2023 heart transplants hit a huge milestone across the nation. More than 4,500 people got new hearts. In 2022, it was 10% lower. What do you attribute the increase to?
Honestly, the advent and initiation of programs that are using new technologies for donation after cardiac death.
Okay.
So we're expanding the donor pool. I mean, in 2016, a little guy from Canada, I think, did the first intentional Hep C heart. That dramatically increased the donor pool. And at least for programs now, and that's relatively commonplace that transplant programs will utilize Hep C hearts. And then really, you know, a couple of programs are right out on the forefront of DCD donation, which is donation after cardiac death, as opposed to brain death criteria. So there's a whole process for that. But that's probably what initiated the increase in uptick in organ availability.
I want to ask Brian about his passion, because Brian, you've made it a mission to raise awareness for organ donation, including getting a green Jeep and souping it up. And let's talk about your Jeep, and if we have pictures of it, I'd love to show it again, and what you do to raise awareness.
So it started pretty organically, just talking to people within the hospital. You know, my initial experience or calling, you might say, was walking down the hall. I think I was about 7 days post-transplant, and Anthony, a friend of mine, is walking the hall, and he's got the LVAD device on him, and he's admitted to get some strength, and they're going to send him home. And I just said, hey, what are you in for? And he tells me what he's doing. And I said, oh, I just had a heart transplant. And he was blown away. He had to physically put his hands on me and touch me, and like, you look amazing.
Oh, that's
How do you look so good? You had a heart transplant 7 days ago? And he was dumbfounded that I did look so good. And that really inspired me to, like, wow, I could really change people's lives just by them seeing me, how well I've done, and how, you know, I can encourage them that they're going to be okay. And, you know, this guy next to me, he I think about day 8 said, Mr. Pitts, you need to leave. Hospitals are for sick people. The
hospitals for sick people.
That's awesome. What a great thing to hear.
Yeah.
What a great thing to
My
hear.
My recovery was, you know, pretty momentous. It was amazing.
Wow. Well, we have some community questions coming in, so I want to get to those. We love when you send us your questions, because we can answer them in real time with our doctors. You can reach us on YouTube, Facebook, the X platform, or the All Things Heart email. All those links are right there on your screen. And let's get to one from Anne. Anne wants to know, Brian, do you plan on contacting your donor's family? Have you tried?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I wrote my 3rd letter last week, and I forwarded it to the Midwest Transplant Network, and they kicked it on to the family. I've not heard yet anything from the family, and talking with the Midwest Transplant folks, they say about 20% of donors and recipients will contact. So
it must be so painful for that family. They know that they did something and saved a life, but that also came with a horrible loss for them. You mentioned you wrote 3 letters so far. How regularly do you write them? I
wrote at 6 months, which is kind of the guidelines. They make you wait 6 months for the grieving period. And I think I wrote again at a year, and I wanted to write again around year 2, but not quite on the date or near that. I wanted to get out a little bit further, considering that's an anniversary of, you know, their death. Even if I don't contact or have a relationship with the family, just knowing something about my donor, in a name, maybe some personality traits, hobbies or likes and dislikes would be enough.
Right. It would help fill in the blanks.
Right.
And help that connection. Anne has an interesting question. Anne wants to know if you had any emotional support through this, like a therapist.
You know, I really didn't. And mine happened so quickly, I don't think there would have been time to set that up. I did have some wonderful counseling with the pastor here in the hospital at the time, and I think she's retired now. She was an older woman, and we talked a couple of times.
Yeah.
Kathy.
Yep.
Kathy.
And you know, Kathy could bring me to tears just because she was so compassionate and such a warm feeling in the room. Wonderful woman, and she brought me some relief. Just having me be able to take a nice deep breath, and you know, she could tell me everything's going to be okay. And that's really kind of all it took. And that's, you know, through mentorship, it's that easy. Just being an ear that's going to listen and saying things like, you're going to do okay. And I can answer some of your general questions and help get you through this. And you'd be surprised how many people are like, wow, that helped so much.
It's obvious. The emotions are so close to your surface, as they would be. They're just right below the surface. Sean wants to know, how do I make sure I'm listed as an organ donor? So what do you do?
Well, I'm being seen by a cardiologist, constantly. It used to be this guy for years and years, and he's the one that pushed me to KU through UNOS to get me listed. It's a
how do you
process.
become a donor?
Oh, how do you become a donor?
Sean wants to know, how do you make sure people know? I know in the back of your driver's license you can check something. Is there any other way?
Yep, you can go to your state's registry and actually fill out to be an organ donor, and that's really the best way to do it.
Okay.
That way there is no question. They'll see the thing on your license, but with the registry they can check the computer and there's no refuting it, there's no question. Your family really can't contest it, and it's going to happen. Those are your wishes.
Jeremy has a question. Jeremy wants to know, could you tell us more about the ability to use Hep C hearts now? You mentioned that lets you have a bigger donor pool.
It's not now. It's about 8 years ago now.
8 years ago.
So,
okay.
there was the advent of the medications that are almost exclusively curative of hepatitis C. So, basically, with the advent of those medications, you could essentially cure hepatitis C, and then so we expanded when I was at Vanderbilt to explore that as a way of obtaining sort of a greater access to an organ pool, because historically those would have been excluded as donors necessarily, except for they were been doing it for liver for
liver. So you figured out a way. They're not you personally, but they figured out a way to expand the donor. How much,
I just
Jeremy?
sew in a circle.
What's that?
I just sew in a circle.
I love how you oversimplify. Doctors are always they're the masters of oversimplifying what you do to save lives. One more question, and then I'll get to final thoughts. Nancy wants to know, how do you treat the children for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy? You mentioned you have 3 kids that tested positive. What do you do when you see those kids? How do you monitor them and test them?
So when I see somebody with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, I always try and get genetic testing completed. And that testing is positive in about 2/3 of patients. And hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is a genetic disease. We just don't have all the genes that cause it. So if we test somebody and they're gene negative, that doesn't mean we have the wrong diagnosis. We have the right diagnosis. It changes the way we manage kids and other family members.
Are there things you can do to make sure or greatly lessen the odds of the children one day needing heart transplants?
There are a variety of studies that have gone on to try and figure out, because not everybody with the gene will manifest hypertrophic cardiomyopathy.
Okay.
They may have the gene. We don't understand what would trigger it in one individual and not in the next. And there have been studies to try and find drugs that would limit that triggering, and not so successful. There's a new class of drugs out now that I'm sure those studies will be forthcoming in those types of patients. But the chance of any one kid having the gene is 1 out of 2.
Oh, okay.
So when you have 3 kids, the chances of all 3 of them being gene positive is 1 out of 8. So
we won the lottery.
Yeah.
All 3 of them.
Yeah. But basically that means that starting from age 12 to 15, every couple of years for a decade, they should have an echocardiogram and an electrocardiogram and see somebody who has expertise about HCM. And then when they get to be about 25-ish, that screening interval typically goes to 5 years. But then at any point, if you develop symptoms, get seen. And symptoms include things like shortness of breath, chest pain, passing out, but
sure.
And then, you know,
that's when
cardiac arrest.
The last symptom you ever want, the cardiac arrest. For final thoughts, this conversation has been wonderful. Brian, what do you want our viewers to know?
It's important to be an organ donor. I mean, that's the first thing you can do. As simple as going and donating blood, there's always a need for that. But register, get on the list. It takes about 2 minutes to do it on the computer. And then you're part of the pool that can help. You know,
because of that, you have someone's heart beating inside you, and you can be a dad.
Random stranger saved my life.
Kids. Wow.
Yep.
Dr. Berenbaum, what would you like our viewers to know?
I think patients need to be vigilant. Well, not all of us need to be vigilant, because including those who aren't patients because they think they're well. But if you have symptoms, go see a doctor, try and figure out what it is. If you're not getting better, if what you're told doesn't make sense, look for somebody else and get another opinion. You know, HCM, unfortunately, is a disease that is often misdiagnosed or overlooked.
Dr. Danter, what are your final thoughts?
My final thoughts are similar to Dr. Berenbaum's. I mean, it's important to be diligent, and it's also important to recognize that there are options out there. I think a lot of times people think, oh, I'm just getting older, or I'm just doing this. And at no time is passing out normal if you're just getting older. That's not the same thing. Or if you're, you know, you used to be able to do something a year ago and now you can't do it. There's something that's going on there. So.
And so many times we have patients on who that's just what they did. They thought, I had a 30-year-old woman on who said, I thought it was old age. I thought, what does that mean? But it's wild.
You know, you rattled off a couple of very technical terms during this, like, you know, you're part of the team.
Sure.
And you are part of it.
I'm now part of the team.
Effort. But, you know, you have educated yourself, and with that education, you have the ability to advocate not just for yourself, but for others. And that's what you're doing, which is amazing.
It surprises me that the people that I talk to, just the other day, I'm on, you know, Facebook group, and guy's 10 years out, and he's got 7 stents, and he doesn't understand why. Why do I have these stents? What's going on with my heart? And I said, you need to read about cardiograph elevation. I can't say it now. CAV.
CAV, okay.
And he didn't know what it was. And I said, my God, man, it's the number 2 killer of transplant people. Number 1 being skin cancer, because we're prone to cancers now that we're immune suppressed, and the medications make us sensitive to sunlight. CAV being number 2, and then infection being the 3rd. And so these are the things that patients should know when they leave.
You're such a good ambassador.
Right. You should know this stuff. And you can help take care of yourself better if you know these things.
Brian, you are saving lives. With your work, you're saving lives as well.
Right.
And we love sharing the incredible work of our doctors here at the health system, because they always save lives. We also love showing you what life looks like for them outside the hospital walls.
Now for a secret look into the guardians of healthcare at the University of Kansas Health System. Let's go behind the mask.
Okay, Dr. Berenbaum, you're first up. Tell us about your beautiful family.
Royals game with my son and his 2 younger kids.
So your 2 grandkids?
And that's my wife with 2 more grandkids.
Oh, how many grandkids do you have?
8.
8?
Wow,
yep. You're fun, Grandpa. And who are those little ones?
Those are the 2 youngest in Chicago.
And do your grandkids think it's fascinating what you do?
Sometimes. The ones that even know. I mean, guess what? The 2-year-old hasn't asked me a lot of questions about being a cardiologist.
With your stethoscope? Do they like to try on your white coat?
She hasn't seen my stethoscope.
Right. Nobody's less impressed than our kids sometimes. You know what I mean? They're like,
ain't that the truth?
It's so true. They're like,
they'd be impressed with a colleague. They'd meet one of your coworkers and say, you have the coolest job.
Like we do the same thing.
Right. Yeah. Well, next up we have Dr. Danter, and we want to talk about your family, Dr. Danter.
Never seen those people before in my life. That's my wife and my 3 girls. And that was, and this is my wife and I in Rome. My wife just turned 50, even though she looks 28.
I totally thought she was way younger than 50. I'm 50.
Yeah, that's us in the academy, and that's Statue of David behind us. We went to Italy. And,
beautiful. So that was her 50th birthday present?
Yeah, we ended up doing it, it took 2 years or a year to get it done. But that's us and our best friends at a winery in Chianti.
Oh, amazing. You want to go back to Italy?
Yeah. I mean,
you need to celebrate 51.
Well, I'll turn 50 one of these days and see if we can get some,
Whenever that happens, way in the future. Yeah. Thank you so much for being with us today. Doctors, thank you. Brian, thank you for everything you do. And to our viewers, we really appreciate your questions and you being part of the conversation. Coming up next week on All Things Heart, nearly 39 million Americans are living with diabetes. We explore the link between diabetes and heart failure and how this woman's experience with diabetes shaped her medical career. That's next week at 8 a.m.
Coming up tomorrow on the Morning Medical Update. Shoulder pain interrupts your work, play, even your sleep. Why suffer with arthritis when surgery can bring relief? I'm Jessica Lovell on the next Morning Medical Update. See one of the newest methods that restores cartilage and eliminates pain, and how quickly one patient returned to a pain-free life. Friday at 8.